Joining us for today's webinar. I'll wait just another second to allow a few more folks to settle in, and then we'll get started. So welcome to today's discussion, the fourth session of the Breakdown, where Steve Levitsky and I talk about the struggle for democracy in the United States, reflect on historical precedents in the US and abroad, and offer evidence-based reflections on the path forward. My name is Erica Chenoweth, and I'm the Frank Stanton Professor of the First Amendment at Harvard Kennedy School, speaking in my individual capacity as a scholar. Before we begin, I have a few announcements to share. The Ash Center acknowledges the land on which Harvard University sits is the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people. We also recognize the continuing presence of the neighboring Wampanoag and Nipmuc nations. A couple of logistics. Today's discussion is being recorded, and you'll receive a link to the recording afterward. The video will also be available on the Ash Center's YouTube channel, and we encourage your participation. Please submit your questions at any time via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll make sure there's ample time for audience questions. Before we go further, let me introduce Stephen Levitsky, who is the David Rockefeller Professor of Latin American Studies, Professor of Government, and Director of the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies at Harvard University. He's also a Senior Fellow at the Kettering Foundation and a Senior Democracy Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. His research focuses on democratization and authoritarianism, political parties, and weak and informal institutions, especially in Latin America. He's co-author with Daniel Ziblatt of How Democracies Die, which was a New York Times bestseller and was published in 30 languages, and Tyranny of the Minority, Why American Democracy Reached the Breaking Point. So Steve, we're going to start this episode with a little poll for our audience. So those attending live can take the poll, and here it is. Which of the following months featured the highest number of recorded protests in a single month in the US since June of 2020? So these are all in the past 13 months. Is it January 2025, June 2025, October 2025, or January 2026? So you can pick one. We'll give you about 5 more seconds to vote, and then we'll share the results.
Hosts and panelists can't vote.
Exactly. What an outrage. I'll ask you your opinion as soon as we see the results. Okay, let's go ahead and close the poll and share the results. Okay, 57% of our viewers are thinking it was just this last month, January 2026, followed by October, June, and January. Steve, what do you think? Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, I was going to guess with the majority. I was going to guess January 2026.
Yeah, what made you think so?
A sense, and we've discussed this in our previous meetings, a sense that there's a growing civic mobilization, in particular, the degree of protest that we've seen around ICE, which is, we've seen a process of learning across cities. And so my perception from afar, and I'm not covering the data like you are, was that there had been a sort of a mounting process of mobilization.
Yeah, it's totally right. Last week, my team at the Crowd Counting Consortium released our latest data update. And I actually was somewhat surprised, I guess, to see that the largest volume of protests in any month so far in the second Trump administration was in January 2026. And in part because, those huge mobilizations that we saw in No Kings 1 and No Kings 2 were so staggeringly large, both in the number of protest locations that those coordinated and in the number of people that turned out, that it seemed like they would sort of still be the largest mobilizations we've seen, but they aren't, right? So last month, January 2026, we saw more protests than in any other month so far. And here's the really striking thing. It's actually the third largest number of protests in a given month that we recorded at all in the US, right? So the largest per month protest happened in June 2020, in the month following the killing of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor. And then the second largest month of protests that's happened in the United States on our record is March 2018, which was both the walkouts, the enough walkouts on the 1 month anniversary of the Parkland shooting, and then 10 days later, the March for Our Lives. So combined, those created a huge number of protests. January 2026, which featured way more distributed protests around the country that were basically just an upswell of protest against authoritarianism in the United States, for lack of a better term, is the third largest month in US history in terms of the number of protests. So as you say, we're seeing really kind of an expansion and escalation of peaceful protest in the country month over month. And so it's interesting that poll, the results showed the smallest number in January 2025 and then subsequently large numbers by the month. That's sort of what the data looks like,
Yeah.
which is very interesting. Okay, so thank you all so much for participating in that poll, and we're going to talk a little bit more about how we might interpret where we are on this sort of protest and consolidation fronts. Steve, the last time you and I talked on this show was in December, and I think you were feeling somewhat optimistic. We talked about the most important developments that we felt folks needed to pay attention to on both the backsliding side and also on the pro-democracy side. And it's amazing how much has happened since then. So on the backsliding side, we saw a massive expansion of federal forces in Minneapolis and St. Paul under the pretext initially of a welfare fraud scandal. The occupation lasted several months and resulted in the killings of federal agents of Renee Good and Alex Preddy, the shootings of several others, and two residents, Renee Good and Alex Preddy, who actually lost their lives in the course of observing ICE operations. And we also saw an attempt, albeit a failed one, to cover up their killings. It's unclear whether or how the state and federal investigations into those killings are going to proceed, and to what effect. Meantime, on the more national level, the president began to talk openly about nationalizing elections and the SAVE Act, which mandates proof of citizenship to vote in federal elections. And that has now passed the House. So, Steve, what do you make of these events of the last 2 months, both in terms of the steps the government has been taking that might indicate further consolidation, and in terms of the public response to it?
Well, first of all, I think the first couple months of the year, I think served to temper to some degree some of our optimism. I mean, there's a when a when a government weakens, it can respond in a couple of different ways. It can respond as normal democratic governments do, which is usually become less ambitious and to take fewer risks, to begin to back down, to negotiate, to consult more, and to govern more pragmatically. Um, or they can radicalize, and that I think it's becoming increasingly clear that that's the dominant response within the Trump administration. They're backing off in some areas, but this is not a government that we can expect is going to just sort of crawl back in its shell when it loses. It's a government that's going to continue to strike in more radical ways, not necessarily succeeding, but it's going to continue to make authoritarian attempts, and it's going to continue to try to destabilize its opponents and to retain the agenda. So very often governments, particularly as they become lame duck governments, they sort of lose the agenda. And this government is intent on not losing the agenda. So I think the optimism that we felt, or that I felt, or that I articulated in late last year, I mean, the underlying basis for that are still there. The government is continuing to weaken. It's continuing to lose support. And as we just showed, uh, society is increasingly reacting. All of that is good news. But this government is going to continue to strike out in increasingly radical ways. And so we've got this dual movement of an opposition that's stronger, but a government that's probably going to be more radical. And that, to me, indicates just suggests a lot of uncertainty ahead. The government is going to continue to throw punches at our institutions and at our society. It may be the fewer of them land. Um, it may be that we have a greater capacity to deflect them. Apologies for the boxing metaphor, but the punches are going to continue to come, and we don't know exactly where and when.
Yeah. Um, I like your sports metaphors in general because I think they help make things very concrete. Um, you know, in terms of whether they land or not, the punches. I think one of the things that strikes me so much about what we saw in Minneapolis and St. Paul is that it was in many ways a microcosm of how successful pro-democracy movements emerge and respond um, in a sort of regional way. So if you think about what successful movements do tend to do, I think we see there the types of capacities that are needed to defend against consolidation nationwide. So, for example, the sort of four things that a lot of us return to in this field is that um, movements for democracy needs mass and diverse participation, varying methods that can impose costs on those who basically comply or acquiesce or implement the authoritarian's plans, defections or loyalty shifts within key societal pillars, discipline and resilience as repression escalates. And underneath all of that, a substantial organizing infrastructure that allows people to effectively, create alternative institutions or care for one another in the meantime. So if we walk through each of those four things, we see mass and diverse participation from all walks of life, spanning across all kinds of differences. We saw faith, labor, teachers, medical providers, veterans, neighborhood and community groups, local leaders, small business owners, unleashing kind of collective power, creativity, and their own networks to try to mobilize a response that was pretty disciplined relative to what was being visited upon the city. In terms of those different methods, the methods that were on display had varying degrees of commitment and risk. People could fully express their agency by engaging in protest, by engaging in the business blackout, non-cooperation, by building alternative institutions or mutual aid networks or participating in those, from participating in the kind of blowing of whistles, calling attention to ICE. And it's clear that that range of strategies and the underlying kind of people power behind it did create defections and loyalty shifts within local pillars. So people who are in positions of influence in the town or in the city, whether that's police, the business community, some Republican leaders in the state even, began to say that it was not okay what was happening there. And there was kind of it almost became attractive to be a business that stood with the community instead of standing with ICE. Discipline and resilience, as repression escalates, people were trained in nonviolent resistance, de-escalation, and other lawful forms of documenting what was happening. And this was really on display. I mean, Alex Preddy himself was observing, right? He was actually trying to film what was happening when he was killed. And other people around him were filming what was happening when he was killed. And that is what makes repression backfire, preparing to observe and communicate broadly abuses that are happening to make obvious that the violence was unjust and disproportionate to the situation. And so, as I mentioned, the sort of underlying network is one of really solid organizing, not in, as we might say, the conspiratorial sense, but in a how can I take care of my neighbors sense of the word. And, there's the example of the woman who is providing surplus breast milk to newborn babies whose mothers had been taken by ICE and then setting up a network to distribute it more broadly. And there were examples of grocery runs, prescription meds runs, for people who are too afraid to leave their homes. And so organizing and preparing with others where people are living, and then really both building and using the networks and relationships that emerge from that is really what gives people power, both the power to withstand what's happening, but also to change what's happening. So, I think to me, the case just helps us to understand at this micro level what is possible and maybe even required at a broader scale. And so I guess the question is, if we think about other cases, either from our own history or from other cases of authoritarian backsliding or even democratic breakthroughs in existing authoritarian countries, how do you see the lessons of Minneapolis kind of translating onto those other cases and giving us examples of the more kind of nationwide infrastructure or formation that could be useful?
It's a good question. I'm not sure I've got a really good comparative answer. a couple of reflections, and I apologize if I don't fully answer your question. First of all, I think one thing we saw in Minneapolis that we've seen in many other cases is that repression often backfires
Mhm.
because it really pisses people off. People don't like repression. Now, sometimes repression is so overwhelming or conditions are such that, autocrats succeed, they get away with repression works, it achieves the objective, but very, repression is a very dangerous instrument for those who wield it. It is unpopular, and one of the really distinctive things about this government, and I find it very, very frightening, is how openly they embrace the use of paramilitary violence. I mean, you asked me to think comparatively. It's hard to find any post-World War II authoritarian regimes that as openly embraced violence as this one, where the state agents basically assassinate, murder two peaceful civilians. And, even Pinochet would have either would have backed away from embracing that violence, right? There are very, very few autocracies anywhere where the government would leap to defend and embrace the killing and
Mhm.
then very actively cover up the killing and go on to further criminalize protest. Most repressors, at least in the post-World War II era, try to downplay, hide, and yeah, basically hide their repression. This government was filming it and diffusing it on social media. It was part of their strategy, and it's awful, but I think it really backfired. I think it generated resistance both in Minneapolis and across the country, and I think it was ultimately a big political mistake. Minneapolis is a this is not an area I know very well, but I think Minneapolis was ended up being a really poor place for this government to sort of launch um, this kind of pilot effort, and a really good place for democracy because Minneapolis is an unusually well organized city with, by most measures, very high levels of social capital. Which is not to say that similar um, levels of organization couldn't and wouldn't emerge in other cities. We saw elements of it in Chicago, obviously, but Minneapolis is a place where the level of social capital is really high to begin with. And so I don't think this administration knew, or ICE knew, what it was messing with when it began to push Minneapolis. This was a place that was unusually well equipped. Not only were they pissed off by the open, naked aggression of ICE agents, but it was a city that was particularly well equipped to respond in the organized fashion that you described, and that is going to have knock-on effects, right? Because it inspired people across the country, and it's going to teach lessons for how to do this, for how to engage in this resistance across the country. But Minneapolis is not your average city. It's a pretty well organized place.
Mhm. Yeah. Some of the questions that we got in advance of this call from folks who registered are about tactics and constituencies that are sort of necessary for countering authoritarianism. Some of the questions were really linked to Minneapolis and asking us to reflect on, the who and the how of the resistance there. Um, and I think more generally, there are just a lot of questions about what people can do as individuals. So one person sent in a question about whether, on balance, protesting, sending letters to Congress people or making phone calls, matter in the contemporary landscape. Um, and then there were certainly much more kind of material tactics like the blackout that I mentioned, and various forms of protest, non-cooperation, and mutual aid. Do you have a sense of, in the cases that you're familiar with, which of the the sort of methods of resistance tend to be the most decisive in pushing back about on backsliding, especially?
No. And I think I can give and I feel free to correct me or disagree with me on this. But I think that this answer is important, that the methods often change, and I think we rarely, if ever, know in advance
Mhm.
which methods are going to work. And that's frustrating because it would be easier and more satisfying for me to be able, and perhaps you can, but I can't. I can't identify a particular strategy that's going to work ex ante in case A, B, or C. I think it almost always is a matter of experimentation and innovation, and the strategies that work in case X um, were hadn't been invented when
Mhm.
in previous case Y. And so, given that again, you may disagree with me, but given that we usually do not know ex ante what is going to work, I think the most important thing, obviously, is that people participate, that they do something.
Mhm.
Two, I think it's really helpful to engage in the activity that is meaningful to you, that where you know people and like people, and it's something that you're comfortable with and is meaningful to you, because you're more likely to sustain it. You're more likely to be good at it. You're more likely to encourage others to engage in it. So engage in the activity that's meaningful to you. And then, of course, we have to be aware in a rapidly changing landscape of what is working elsewhere. I think consumer boycotts and raising the cost of cooperating with this government is increasingly important in this case. The United States, and that in much poorer countries, for example, uh, you don't have a wealthy upper middle class that can engage in powerful consumer boycotts. That's something that this country with our big upper middle class can do. And another lesson from Minneapolis is that I think you mentioned the word solidarity, that what I call democratic solidarity, that getting in a kind of mode of action where we recognize other citizens who may face a different problem and may be different from us, but who are being assaulted by the same authoritarian government, and being able and willing to mobilize in their defense, working seeing as teammates a very diverse group of people, and we really saw that at work in Minneapolis. So at the same time that we don't know in advance what strategy is going to work, we have to be paying close attention to what's working elsewhere, um, and adapting strategies.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more with what you said. I would add, one of the things that you have written a lot about and spoken a lot about is the importance of how institutions respond or don't respond, right? And I think that what that means is that, as you pulled out, this issue of consumer boycotts and making it costly to to go along with the regime is a way that people can think about what are the methods of influence that one can apply, to these different institutions to get them to throw their power behind the pro-democracy movement, as opposed to trying to stay on the sidelines, basically, and just let it play out and then go with the winning side, right? The key institutions in our civil society that represent business and faith and labor and all these other pillars, um, aren't kind of neutral actors in this. Their behaviors really influence where the country goes. And so, I think generally speaking, if the orientation is toward trying to either persuade or encourage or push those institutions into the pro-democracy side of the field, the more effective the tactics will be, right? And so because
Absolutely.
of that, I think there isn't like a recipe, a formula, or some tried and true sequence of tactics, but there's an overall kind of strategic orientation to what is needed in order to get information. And I think that was definitely on display there in Minneapolis, where it wasn't just that people were going out and marching and having vigils. They were doing that, right? But they were doing so much more to sort of orient the entire city and its key institutions into a posture of democratic solidarity, like you said. So yeah, like you said too, to the question of does any of this matter? I think it probably all matters, right? The counterfactual is that people really aren't doing anything. If people aren't doing anything, there's no friction at all for authoritarian consolidation, and is a much more dangerous landscape.
Right. And resistance, as you know and have written, builds on itself, right? When people first started blowing whistles, there were a lot of doubters. People did the initial whistleblowers were not sure that it would matter, that it would make a difference. Um, and we didn't know in advance for sure that that was the formula, but it
Hmm.
mattered a lot.
Yeah, yeah. You know, uh, we've talked a little bit about tactics and methods. I think another question that comes up for a lot of folks is around these institutions and the sort of necessary constituencies for defeating authoritarianism. I talked a few minutes ago about the different societal pillars. And I'm curious about where you think key institutions are or sectors are in the country now, 13 months into the administration. Have you seen any movement toward or against kind of the democratic project, the small d democratic project in institutions over the past few months that gives you either concern or some hope?
Well, we've definitely seen movement, and I think we saw, I think, traces of this already when in earlier conversations, Erica, but it's
Yeah.
now really incontrovertible that the greatest movement has been from below. Citizens with the least power, privilege, and influence are the ones who have been most willing to go out and act. And I think this is a question that social scientists are going to have to be reflecting upon for years to come. But those with really in many respects the most vulnerable, the most to lose, including in a few cases lives, have been the boldest in standing up for democracy. But that is beginning. I mean, as that is shifting public opinion, and it influences the more powerful actors more gradually, somewhat indirectly. But when media is beginning to pay attention more than it was 6 months ago. You've been covering and counting protest for the last 14 months. It's been surprisingly high and rising, but the media has only gotten on board covering that with the exception of the No Kings rallies very recently. And of course, politicians are beginning to pay attention as well. One of the things that um, one of the good things about primaries is that largely Democratic Party politicians have to compete for votes, and the people who are active in the resistance are going to be voting in most cases in primaries, and so that's a direct incentive, it's a direct mechanism through which politicians are being pulled into the fray, so to speak, and they've been slow. Um, as I've said in other occasions, most Democratic Party politicians were trained in another era. They were socialized in another era. They know how to raise money and win votes and legislate. They don't know how to do social movement politics, but they're finding they have to be engaged. And so we're seeing if you compare where we are to where we were 6 and 9 months ago, I think media coverage is better. I think there are more Democratic Party politicians who are really engaging the authoritarian threat. Not enough, but more. And gradually, we're seeing some movement by businesses, but it's slow,
Hmm.
but it's coming. I'm much more comfortable. You might have seen this 6, 9 months ago. I am now very comfortable making a sort of causal claim that our elites are being pulled from below
Hmm.
into more aggressive resistance.
Hmm. Interesting. No, you're the perfect person for this question, I think, because this next question about the relationship between the movement and the party, the Democratic Party in this context. So, in a lot of other contexts, one of the key problems for pro-democracy movements is that they have a very divided opposition, meaning that the opposition not only can't get along with each other, but is often a bunch of different parties that
Sure.
what they have to do is they have to kind of combine into a unity formation and back a unity candidate or something like that to mount an effective challenge at the polls. Now, in our country, what we have is we have an opposition party with factions, right? I love it when your lights go out, right? In a dramatic pause. We have basically a two-party system, each of which has its own factions. It's a slightly different problem set, right? Because it's a single party with factions that themselves can be difficult to align. And there's also the problem of whether the opposition party itself represents a significant enough constituency in order to mount an effective opposition. And so I'm curious how you're thinking about that. I mean, is the task to try to pivot the orientation of popular participation in elections to one that's more about pro-democracy versus pro-authoritarianism, or is it to try to basically maintain the existing partisan landscape and hope for a more productive realignment in the existing parties?
Yeah, it's a good and tough question. I mean, first of all, and I think I've said this before, I think we are, as much as we complain, um, in terms of small d Democratic oppositions, we are in much, much better shape than any other backsliding case that I know of. For the reason that you began with, which is in the vast majority, in fact, every other backsliding case I know of,
Mm,
you have a really fragmented and often really badly discredited opposition. The Democratic Party was not in great shape in terms of its brand in 2025, but you compare it to Mexico or Hungary or El Salvador or Turkey, the Democratic Party is in much, much better shape. So the fact that it is a single party that, for all of its limitations, continues to be electorally viable is really important. I
mm,
think it's also the case that although the defense of democracy has to happen on multiple fronts, not just at the ballot box. The ballot box, you probably agree, continues to be the principal avenue with which we're going to stop this authoritarian offensive. Again, it's not the only one. And if we relied entirely on the ballot box, we'd be in serious trouble. But at the end of the day, winning elections, first in 2026 and then in 2028, is an indispensable part of ending this authoritarian episode. And so I think ultimately, I don't know if this is an answer to your question or not, I think there will be inevitably a division of labor. I think
mm,
particularly as we get closer to the 2026 election, and then eventually as we get closer to the 2028 election, there will be party politicians, candidates who are out there spending their time and figuring out how to win elections. And they'll make a calculus about whether they should embrace protesters or not, whether, what language they should use, how much they should talk about democracy. But their job, the politicians, the people trying to win Senate seats or eventually trying to win the presidency, their principal job is to win elections. Because
mm,
if they don't win elections, we don't remove authoritarians from power. Um, that doesn't mean that activists in Minneapolis or Chicago or anywhere, or whether it's people on the civil liberties front or the voting rights front, shouldn't be out there engaged in all sorts of strategies aimed at defending rights and defending democracy. And they may pull the lever for a Democratic Party or candidate on election day, but that's really not their job and that's not their primary purpose. So I think as a broad, small d democracy movement, we absolutely have to be doing both. There have to be people who are
mm,
working full time on the defense of human beings and rights that are under threat every day. And there have to be folks who are mostly focusing on, doing the polling and the focus groups necessary to win elections. Now we can debate whether the Democrats are doing that well or poorly, and whether they need to what strategy is best for winning elections. But it makes sense to me that there will be some of us who are not me, but some of us who are focused on winning elections, because saving democracy requires winning elections.
Yeah. It really strikes me that, earlier we were talking about Pinochet. He was peacefully removed from power through a referendum, which he was surprised he lost, right?
Yep.
And the civil society was prepared both to create the conditions in which the referendum could take place, the conditions through which they could actually win the referendum on whether he could extend his time in power, and they were prepared to enforce the result of the referendum. Right. So there's sort of three things happening in existing authoritarian contexts: creating the conditions for it to happen, making it happen, and then enforcing the result. And I think, if you think about some of the key places where far right authoritarian regimes collapsed, Pinochet's Chile, the apartheid regime in South Africa, right? It was forced to hold open elections. That was the primary mechanism through which the country escaped the sort of apartheid status quo.
Yeah, I can
Solidarity
say
with
one thing
Poland.
about Chile.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
Chile is a great example where a very diverse opposition came together behind a common theme and a common strategy. For anybody who's not seen the movie, no,
Hmm.
it's worth seeing. These guys fought about everything. They disagreed about marketing strategies. They disagreed about how to present themselves. They disagreed about whether they should focus on human rights violations or just present a happier message about the future. They were very, very different tendencies and factions with very different ideas about about how to move forward, who were able to unite behind a common cause of restoring democracy and opposing Pinochet. And so, and the differences that existed in the center left coalition in Chile are far greater than whatever differences we may see between center and left factions in the Democratic Party.
No doubt
This is
about it.
nothing
Yeah.
compared to what they faced.
That's right. Yeah, no doubt about it. And it's a great example. It was, they didn't exactly call it this, but it was basically United Front. And the same was in South Africa. There was United Democratic Front, right? An umbrella formation that brought together hundreds and hundreds of civic groups. The ANC was part, but it wasn't the whole thing. It wasn't even necessarily the most decisive actor and at certain moments. And so I think there, the primary strategy was unite everybody around some minimal points of agreement in order to create the conditions through which, through popular mobilization and elections, a democracy movement can succeed. And with the expectation that in the aftermath of that, they'll have to compete with each other, right, to define
Yep.
the future of the country. And like that is what they were fighting for, is the ability to compete through elections and through their institutions in a democratic way. So I agree with you that elections are really important, and that the main difference in a backsliding context is the idea of preparing for the kind of basically two different strategies. One is the strategy of winning the elections with pro-democracy candidates, and the other is the strategy of enforcing the result through as you mentioned, kind of litigation strategies, through all of the different kind of nonviolent methods at the movement's disposal. Um, so I think we should probably take some time with audience Q&A at this point, because we've been chatting for a while. And one of them is actually a follow-up from something you said earlier, Steve, which was about what social capital means exactly. So you mentioned in Minneapolis that it's a city with high social capital, and you described that a little bit. I think the questioner is asking, can you elaborate on why Minneapolis has high social capital? Like, where did it come from, and in what ways did we see it manifest, and might we see it manifest elsewhere?
So I'm not an expert on social capital. I'm referring primarily to the work, to the very, very important work uh, of Robert Putnam in the late 1990s and early 2000s. He wrote a famous political science book called Making Democracy Work. Later, a more widely read book on social capital in the United States called Bowling Alone. Um, but in effect, what he's referring to is social trust, the degree to which I know my neighbors, cooperate with my neighbors, and trust that my neighbors will do the right thing. It's sort of a shared social trust within a community, and it Putnam hypothesized that it was a product of civil society, that the more that we participate in civic groups, and it doesn't matter much at all what civic groups they are. They don't have to be political groups. They might be, but they might be churches. They might be, uh, choral societies. They might be neighborhood associations. They might be local parent teacher associations. But the more that communities participate in civic groups, the more they get to know one another and they get used to working with one another and they trust one another. And what Putnam argued and showed initially in Italy, but also in the United States, is that communities vary. There are some places where, for a variety of different reasons, social capital is really low. People don't really know their neighbors. They don't talk to their neighbors. They stay home and watch TV, or they drive off to the mall rather than participate in some kind of local activity in on the weekend. There are other communities that are very participatory, where people know everybody in the street. You organize block parties every month, and you go to church with the same people, or perhaps you belong to the same local union or Lions Club or Elks Club with your neighbors. And there's a long pattern of helping one another, of being able of knowing if there's a problem, you can reach out to neighbor X and neighbor Y to help collectively solve that problem. And by most measures, Minneapolis, the northern Midwest in particular of the United States, is pretty high in social capital. I don't know enough to say exactly why that's the case, but it's a pretty well organized. These are pretty well organized communities with high levels of social capital by most measures. And for example, the deep South, the South of the United States, is lower in social capital. So that's pretty much the amount I know about social capital. But this is drawing on the work of Bob Putnam.
Yeah, I think that's a great summary. I would add there's sort of there's sort of an interesting dimension of distinction between different types of social capital too. So there's what Putnam refers to as highly bonded social capital, and then there's bridging social capital. And this is a really important distinction because I think people have different things in mind when they think about what it would mean to have high trust in neighborly associations and things like that. Um, I think our civil society is actually quite robust, but it's highly bonded, which means that most people hang out with people who are very much like themselves, and they choose to associate when they do associate with organizations or community concerns with those where they would find people like themselves, right? So it's that would be bonded civil society where there's some pre-existing affinity or identity or something that unites the people who choose to spend time together in a group.
I'm on a
And
I'm on a Jewish softball team, for example. That's bonding social capital.
for sure. And then there's the bridging social capital. And bridging social capital would be where people come together in spaces where it's sort of apolitical and it is about some common aim that isn't tied to one's own affinities or identity, other than, say, shared location. Like this would be like a city initiative to clean up the city, or YMCA's or YWCA's might be sites of interaction where it's recreational, like people are just getting together, and the only thing they have in common is that they want to play ball. And this is gets behind the title of Bob's book, Bowling Alone. His argument was that this used to be like bowling leagues, like people would definitely interact with people from a different political identity, from a different ancestral background, from a different ethnic identity or racial identity, and sometimes even from a different class in these bowling leagues. And so you get this bridging opportunity where people are able to identify some kind of shared concern about community well-being. And so I think I only mention that because I think our country is pretty high on the bonded civil society front, but less on the bridging civil society front over the last number of years, or at least that's what Putnam's main kind of assertion is. And I think that they serve different purposes, right? So if the idea then is that what a pro-democracy social movement needs to do is to effectively find ways to tap into existing relationships and expand the influence and pressure from a movement, bridging needs to be part of that kind of orientation, even if it's not the whole thing. So, okay. We've got another question about No Kings. The question is, are the No Kings protests an effective form of protest, and would they be stronger paired with, say, a positive agenda for addressing working class economic concerns or specific demands for reform? So maybe I'll take the first swing at this one, and then I'm really curious what you would say, Steve. My sort of short take on No Kings protests, which I understand the question to mean these very large kind of single day demonstrations where there's thousands of different locations and huge numbers of people engaged in, a common day of action. My sort of short take on this is that it is equally dangerous to underestimate the power of a single day of protest as it is to overestimate the power of a single day of protest. On the underestimating side, I think it is incredibly important for there to be opportunities where people are able to recognize across society how many people are willing to give up time on a Saturday to come out and make a common demand. It often allows people to tap into new local networks, especially when organizers are doing that work and they're organizing people who come out and protest, to engage in more sustained action. It is also a way for there to be sort of innovation around the types of concerns, demands, issues that a community wishes to express, and those can find their way not only into kind of the movement's own orientation, but also into like literally the agenda of a town meeting or a legislative meeting at the state or national level. So we shouldn't underestimate how important that can be. And we also shouldn't overestimate it, right? And I think this is kind of a shared realization of many people across the country, which is that, protest is incredibly vital for all the reasons I mentioned, and on its own has a tough time putting the amount of pressure required on the different institutions that need to be in the pro-democracy camp, that other methods or a broader strategy might be able to apply. And so I think the main takeaway here is for all the reasons we mentioned earlier, like doing anything, doing something is very, very important. And it's also important for people who are engaged to find a political home and a way of sustaining their engagement with others where they are, to sort of maximize the impact of their activism and advocacy and organizing. And then, to the what should they be demanding part of the question of whether they should be articulating a sort of positive vision. I mean, on the division of labor question that Steve brought up earlier about like there's a social movement role around elections and then there's a party role around elections. I think the same is true for articulating a sort of negative demand and a positive demand. I think these two things are absolutely important to be happening at the same time, but they don't necessarily have to be emerging from the same formation. And as our colleague Adam Jaworski has argued in his newsletter, being against something unites and being for something divides. And so it can be useful sometimes to have a division of labor in that respect as well.
Yeah, I'm going to be brief because I think you've taken all the main points I want to make. I think the impact of No Kings has been modest but important. There's no question, particularly during 2025 and first half of 2025 when there was so little resistance. Particularly when, we initially looked to elites to resist, and they didn't. We looked to the Democratic Party to resist. It didn't. It was really, really important for the tens of millions of Americans who are committed to defending democracy and who are appalled and frightened at what was going on. It was really important to signal that there were so many millions of Americans not only opposed to what was happening, but willing, as Erica said, to spend time on their Saturday mobilizing against it. So just as a signaling event for other Americans, it was very, very important. And it didn't have a revolutionary effect, but it did. Judges were paying attention, media editors were paying attention, politicians were paying attention. And the other thing that these protests do is it gives people something to do, and it creates multiple opportunities for engagement. So I cannot count the number, perhaps Erica can, of people who went to their first, for this was their initial point of contact, and they met somebody or became aware of some organization or some movement and stayed involved. If you went to the protest, you were more likely to bring your friend to the next protest, and you were more, not everybody, but a not insignificant percentage of people got engaged for the first time through No Kings and stayed engaged one way or another in a thousand different ways. And so it's only part of the overall defense of democracy, but I think it was an important one. I completely agree that it's really important to have a simple message. I think No Kings was a very effective one, and there is a tendency. There's there's always a kind of incentive to try to pile 13, 14, 18 different causes that we believe in into the march, but that has the impact, one, as Jaworski says, of dividing, but two, of just diluting the message and diluting the identity. There is a real power to simplicity. And I think No Kings actually did that quite well.
Great, thank you. I'll just I just was reminded from what you said of an article that Christian Davenport published a number of years ago called "Activism and Awareness," and it introduces this concept he calls cognitive activation. And what the study did was they surveyed a number of activists in India who were associated with resistance against untouchability, basically, and surveyed them about their participation in protests against untouchability and the impacts that it had on their later awareness of discrimination against Dalits. And they found a very strong association between actually showing up physically at a protest against untouchability and then later being able to recognize episodes of discrimination. So there's something about, participating actively physically in something that opens up the possibility that people's orientation, that their frame of mind, that what they pay attention to becomes much more aligned with the things that the movement are about. And that can happen over the long term. So it's kind of a radicalizing process, but really it's more just raising political awareness and the ways that can affect each individual, and then the ways that can affect the sort of collective consciousness of a country over the long term. So again, I think these protests, especially when they look like they're the only game in town, are absolutely essential. So maybe we have a chance for one more question, and then we'll wrap it up today, Steve. So we have one coming in following on Steve's comments about the business community. There's a question about recruiting support from business. So corporations have been reluctant to get involved. And they point to a statement from Minneapolis CEOs or Minnesota CEOs, which they refer to as wishy-washy, although I suppose some might say it was amazing that they came out with any statement at all. But the question is, how does business end up getting involved in these things? And so, if you can reflect at all about what you know from other instances or from our own about when business starts to shift in its orientation. I think that's what the person is asking.
Well, in general, I mean, I would make some distinct, and I'm not an expert on this at all. But often there's a distinction to be made between local businesses and larger companies. I know that in the city of Boston, for example, as the city began to prepare several months ago for a possible ICE mobilization or assault on the city of Boston, and tried to in anticipation tried to recruit businesses. Um, they had difficulty, and they found that local small businesses were much more likely to do it than bigger businesses. So when the owner of the business is a member of the community, and perhaps participates in other organizations with members of the community, you're much more likely to get a commitment to to engage. Beyond that, once you rise above the local level, um, I've had my heart broken by business for decades, in the sense that you hope that businesses will rise up when the moment comes to defend democracy. Big businesses are going to follow the dollars. They're going to behave in ways that are consistent with making money. And so one problem that we have this round, that one difference between Trump 1.0 and Trump 2.0, is that this Trump administration is making it really, really clear, particularly to the largest, most profitable firms, that if they want to continue to make money at the pace that they've been making, they have to play ball with the Trump administration. Not only should they not be in opposition, but they got to be working with Trump. Jeff Bezos has to be, turning the Washington Post into a center right newspaper. And so the Trump administration made it really clear where the money is to be made. And so that's made turning business much more difficult. But it's meant, and going back to the consumer boycott issue we were talking about earlier, we have to make it costly for companies to cooperate with the government. And that's hard to do. And many consumer boycotts fail. Most of them fail. But there is an opportunity, because we have a really big, very wealthy upper middle class in this country, much of which identifies with the resistance, much of which opposes the Trump administration. And so coordinated efforts to make it costly to be a company that cooperates with ICE, that provides technology to ICE, that rents out its hotels or its cars to ICE. That's the way to do it. You've got to make it less profitable to cooperate with the Trump administration. I think moral persuasion, unfortunately, is not going to work beyond the local level.
Well, Steve, it's always a pleasure. And thank you so much to everybody who's joined us today live. We will be talking again toward the end of March, right on the eve of the next No Kings, March 24th, this time in the morning, 9 to 10 a.m. Eastern. So for those who are joining, who weren't able to join live, or who missed the opportunity to do Q&A, we will include a link to register in that event in a follow-up email to everybody who registered here, along with the recording of today's discussion. Thank you again so much to everyone and to the team here at the Ash Center for putting on this webinar, and look forward to the next time.
Thanks so much, Erica.